Disaster movies are nothing new, but Roland Emmerich is the high watermark for the modern it-all-blows-up extravaganza. There are 4 of his faces on the disaster flick Mount Rushmore. Well, 3, and then The Rock is the 4th because he's on every Mount Rushmore now. Set any Roland Emmerich disaster movie right next to any other disaster movie, and for my money, the other one gets crumbled like a world-famous landmark with alien laser-like precision.
Is that the Eiffel Tower?
I think so.
So, what is it about Roland Emmerich's disaster films that are a little more enduring than others? And this is not about good or bad, or better or worse. This is about a filmmaker that is clearly doing something right.
Not bad.
It's about Roland Emmerich and the art of escalating nonsense. There's a sequence in 2012 where LA gets owned by, well, it's the sun. The sun is the bad guy in 2012, and it starts simply enough. They're escaping from a massive earthquake, driving through a yard to get past a pair of slow grandmas. Then it's a quick ramp in a limo before they literally get covered in narrowly scrape under a collapsing freeway and through an entire building. Then later, they also fly a plane through a different collapsing building. The sequence is pure silliness and unpredictable except for one thing. For all its twists, turns, and screeching tires, really, it's a straight line. A 45-degree angle on a bonkers graph, and it's a microcosm of a career's worth of remarkable disaster movies. But what about Universal Soldier, you might be asking? That's not technically a disaster movie, you're saying, correctly. Well, no, it's not. But what it is it's great. I love it. And there are traces of what makes him so adept at the disaster movie formula in even his less blowy-uppy fare. So, going back to the beginning of his big-budget career, it all starts with the grain of truth. Before he started making world-destroying blockbusters, even his early Hollywood career was all about the bonkers premise. Universal Soldier is about cryogenically frozen super soldiers with a decades-long beef. Think about that.
I have to cool down.
But Stargate though, he really starts digging into the first steps of his formula. The premise is bonkers, yes. An alien artifact is found on the Giza Plateau that opens a portal to a planet outside our known universe. At the core of it, though, is the idea that aliens built the pyramids, a pseudo-archaeological absurdity that's so dumb it's actually well known.
Martians, perhaps.
It's a trick he uses across his disaster films. Keep the bananas at least a little familiar to allow us to, on some level, buy into the premise.
So chicken.
The loglines of his films will all ring a bell. The Day After Tomorrow is about global warming. 2012 takes a mysterious Mayan doomsday calendar some believe to be prophetic. Independence Day's alien invasion might be the most far-fetched, but it's a science fiction subgenre that's been a real fear since the days when Orson Welles was on the radio. Point is, we're familiar with the premise, which allows Emmerich to launch that sliver of credibility towards the stratosphere of its own most extreme possible outcome. But before the formula gets too far away, start small. Once the bonkers gets you in the door, it's important to dial back. In the film that's most famous for being the follow-up to Stargate, Independence Day takes great pains to start small. We meet our main characters stubbing their toes on kids' toys, missing their spouses, or playing chess in the park with their dad before running off to a job he's ludicrously overqualified for. You know, relatable stuff. Even the danger looming over the entire film is introduced by waking up a guy in the middle of the night, which, as we all know, is the worst. These are everyday people with everyday annoying problems who are about to deal with extraordinary circumstances. But that's a film with an actual villain to defeat. The Day After Tomorrow's Dennis Quaid can't be expected to beat up the climate any more than 2012's John Cusack can keep the Earth's crust from rotating. So they're both introduced as fathers who struggle to be there for their children. Now, does this mean the real villain of these films is adult male irresponsibility? Not really, but what it does do is start small. So, in the first reel of film, the Emmerich formula presents you with a premise you've heard of before and characters you can relate to. There's a trust there now. There's a solid foundation on which to light a fuse.
You think we'll get to Washington and won't be there?
With the grain of truth planted in a field of relatable characters, it's time for that bonkers premise to show back up. The end of a film's first act typically features a plot device that fundamentally changes the course of our characters' stories. In a Roland Emmerich film, that plot point typically changes the course of the planet. Take Independence Day. Act 1 ends with aliens launching an all-out attack on Earth's major cities. The question of whether or not the aliens are here to party is answered with a massive set piece. We watch New York, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles get blown away in a hail of space locust tech savvy. The sequence from 2012 that we walked through earlier, the one with the covered limousine in Los Angeles sliding into the ocean, sits in the same spot structurally, while The Day After Tomorrow uses the end of Act 1 to flood Manhattan with a frigid Statue of Liberty-sized tidal wave. Narratively speaking, Roland Emmerich's disaster films introduce themselves by saying, "You've heard of this before, just like these nice people have, and right off the bat I want you to know about the worst case scenario." Once the shit hits the fan in a Roland Emmerich film, it really just continues hitting the fan, or, as we've already seen twice, gets splattered across the windshield of a limo. Anything still standing after the end of Act 1 set piece is on the chopping block through the escalating mayhem in Act 2. After a Russian tanker floats through the streets of Manhattan, tragedy plays out on the frozen roof of a shopping mall, and our heroes are chased by literal cold air, The Day After Tomorrow features a sequence that made me say, out loud, "Now there are f***ing wolves coming after them?" When the White House sees its end in 2012, it's not just with an enormous tidal wave that would have been more than enough. Emmerich also drops an aircraft carrier on it, destroying the landmark with 2 things at once instead of his previous record of just 1 thing. But at some point, you kind of run out of famous buildings to blow up. And that brings us to the key to wrapping up a Roland Emmerich disaster film. The climax needs to come full circle and be every bit as silly as the premise sounded way back when you bought that ticket.
Because they're not spaceships, buddy. They're arcs.
Independence Day gives us the most incredible example of this by using a computer virus to thwart a full-scale global assault. But let us not forget, 2012 ends with a massive arc with an engine problem, floating through the Himalayas like a log flume ride, and the captain saying, "We're about to run into Mount Everest." These are the kind of endings that only have a chance of working because of the groundwork laid up front. Because of the tone set by LA cracking in half in Act 1, that 2012 would end trying to avoid crashing into the tallest mountain on the planet is as inevitable as the sun's neutrinos superheating the Earth's core. There's nothing to be done but ride that mile-high wave. Standing back from the movies and describing them out of context, as, to be fair, I've done here, doesn't do justice to the skill that's actually being wielded in these films.
Oops.
There is nonsense aplenty in the gleeful destruction of landmarks around the world, but it's only with proper escalation of that nonsense that these films actually work. Whether or not you like his films, Roland Emmerich is undeniably onto something that elevates his work over other disaster movies. Like Jean Claude Van Damme and Dolph Lundgren resuming their Vietnam-era conflict on a farm in the 90s, Roland Emmerich is... wow. Well, you know what? I got nothing. I started with some nonsense and I couldn't I couldn't back it up with anything. Man, that really is hard.
Good night, asshole.